The spiritual practice that we're going to talk about today is fasting. And I was going to begin by pointing out that I can't imagine anything more unusual and countercultural than talking about fasting. But instead of saying that, I think I want to say something broader than that. I can't imagine anything more unusual and countercultural than embracing these spiritual practices, all of them. Actually putting ourselves in a place where God can work and choosing to do these things that are sometimes called disciplines that will give God room to work, that is something that is unusual, wonderful, good, to be commended, certainly, but it is unusual. We've talked about study. Study takes time. We've talked about worship. Worship requires a commitment. It calls for action. We've talked about prayer, again, something that would require focus and attention. We've talked about meditation, actually choosing to dwell on certain things in our lives. We've talked about submission, something that is certainly against our nature to consider. We've talked about solitude. We've talked about simplicity. Both of those things very different than what our world values and expects. So in every case so far, we're talking about these practices that are wonderful, that enrich our spiritual lives, that give God room to work, but things that are very different than what we might normally do. And that's certainly true with the topic that we'll talk about today, our spiritual practice called fasting. It would be an easy one to leave out. In our particular culture, in our time in history, fasting is not something that is emphasized very much. Richard Foster, who did a lot of work on fasting, says that when he studied the subject, he found an almost 100-year period in the mid-1800s to the mid-1900s where there was not a single book about fasting even published during that time. So it's kind of an odd subject, but one that has gotten a great deal of attention in recent years. It's kind of easy to explain why people let that discipline, that practice go. Back in the Middle Ages, 400 or 500 years ago, fasting was extremely important in the life of the church. In fact, people would use fasting as a way to measure their depth of spirituality. And if you were really serious about your faith, you would fast. And then you might even begin to brag about your fasting. And the people who were really serious about walking with Jesus were quite open about their success in this practice. And it became very legalistic. And people were offended by that, and you can kind of see why people backed off and pushed in the other direction. But we do that at our peril, because there's something about fasting that is extremely important. We might think that fasting is essentially choosing to go without food for a spiritual purpose, and that's part of what's happening. But more important than simply choosing to go without food is deciding where exactly we're going to put our focus and what things in life are most important to us. Food is one thing we can fast from, although people talk about fasting from all kinds of other things. Catherine Marshall, in one of her books, even talks about fasting from a critical spirit. She challenged people to take one day and to fast from critical thoughts and words, and to do that literally for one day if they could. And she discovered that that practice was life-changing. So she talked about a fast from a critical spirit. But generally speaking, when we talk about fasting, we're talking about doing without food for a time so that we can put our focus on God. It isn't going without food only. It's saying to ourselves that just because we have a need or a desire or an interest, that doesn't mean we have to respond to that need or that desire or that interest. I remember growing up, and my mom and dad would often say something to me, and it bothered me a great deal at the time, and I didn't always agree with them. I even argued with them sometimes, but they would say to me, "Barry, there are some things in life that you don't need to experience." And as a young person, I thought, well, that's silly. I need to experience everything. But they said, no, there's some things in this life that you don't need to experience. And at that time in life, they were obviously trying to protect me and keep me from things that would do me harm. But there's a great principle there at work as well. Not everything we desire is something we need to respond to. Not everything we think we need is something we need to give into. Not everything we want is something that should be ours. And fasting is one way of acting on that and saying that we understand that. Food is obviously something we do need. But when we fast, we're saying that we're going to do without something that is good, something that is important, something that we need to survive in order to put our attention on something that is more important, on God. What you're fasting from may not be quite as important as what you're feasting on while you fast. And so the attention you give to God while you're fasting is extremely important as well. When we do that, if we do that, we will learn some very, very important things about ourselves. Things will happen to us spiritually if we choose to fast. For example, if we choose to fast, we will grow in our prayer life, and we will find our prayer being more and more effective. If we fast, we will find ourselves being more sorrowful for our sin. If we fast, we will find ourselves being more aware of God's guidance. When we fast, we increase our spiritual concentration. We can even increase our physical and emotional well-being when we fast, but all of that is really secondary, because when we fast, we choose to put our focus on God and we feast on God. Now, I'm not prepared to do a 40-day fast, and you're probably not either, but I might be able to go without a meal this week. And I might take the money that I would spend on that meal and I might give that money away. And I might take the time that I would have used for that meal and I might use that time praying or doing some act of service. I might feel hungry and feel that I've done damage to my body, but the spiritual benefit of that will far outweigh anything that I lose. It is an unusual practice. There's no question about it. It is not widely practiced in our world today, even the Christian world today. That is true as well. But another spiritual step we can take that will give God room to work: fasting.